road I went and stayed too long.
In the summer of 1972, a group of musicians showed up to work. They walked to the door of Hitsville, USA, the studio that had given America its greatest soul music, and found a note taped to the door. Session canceled. We'll reschedule. There was no reschedule. There was no goodbye. Motown was gone. Today we go inside the 10 real reasons it happened. The riots, the lawsuits, the broken promises, the Hollywood obsession, and the artists who got left behind. This is how Hitsville became Hollywood. Number 10, the Detroit riots of 1967. Before we talk about the move, we have to talk about the fire. July 23, 1967, Detroit. It started at 4 in the morning. Police raided an unlicensed after-hours bar on 12th Street, arrested 82 people, and a crowd gathered outside. What followed was 6 days of the deadliest civil unrest in American history to that point. 43 people killed, over 1,000 injured, more than 2,000 buildings burned, 7,000 people arrested. The National Guard was deployed. The U.S. Army was deployed. And for the first time in years, the studio at 2648 West Grand Boulevard went completely silent. Motown was near the epicenter. The label had 8 singles on the Billboard Hot 100 that week, including 2 in the top 20. Berry Gordy received threatening phone calls at the label during the riots. The staff was terrified. Martha Reeves, whose song Dancing in the Street had been released 3 years earlier as a pure celebration of summer, watched from inside as her city burned. She said years later, "You can't live in this world and not be affected by the things that surround us." Dancing in the Street would later be reinterpreted by civil rights scholars as a coded anthem of protest. Martha always maintained it was about joy, about summer, about freedom. But in July 1967, freedom in Detroit was not guaranteed. The riots were the first crack in the foundation. Mary Wilson of the Supremes wrote in her memoir, Supreme Faith, that the unrest was part of the initial impetus for Motown's move west. Berry Gordy had already opened a Los Angeles office in 1963, but after 1967, the city he had built his empire in felt less like home. The street was no longer dancing, and Berry Gordy was already looking toward the exit. Number 9, Holland, Dozier, Holland, Walk Out. Imagine losing your entire hit-making engine in a single day. That's what happened to Berry Gordy in 1968. Won't you stop? Holland, Dozier, Holland. 3 names that should be on every list of the greatest songwriters in American music history. Brian Holland, Lamont Dozier, Eddie Holland. Between 1963 and 1967, 5 years, they wrote and produced over 50 top 10 pop and R&B hits. 12 number ones for the Supremes alone. Stop, In the Name of Love, Baby Love, You Keep Me Hanging On, Reach Out, I'll Be There, for the 4 tops. Heat Wave for Martha and the Vandellas. How Sweet It Is, Bernadette. Where Did Our Love Go? Mary Wilson of the Supremes said it plainly in a Washington Post interview in 1986. Holland Dozier, Holland left, and the sound was gone. In late 1967, the team stopped submitting songs to Motown. They had spent years watching their royalty checks arrive without royalties from Motown publishing arm, Jobet. They believed they were being underpaid. They were right. Stop in the name of love. Eddie Holland later said in a Billboard interview that the moment he saw Brian's royalty check for co-writing and co-producing Please Mr. Postman, he realized he was on the wrong side of the business. By early 1968, they were gone. Gordy sued them for breach of contract. They countersued. The litigation dragged on for nearly 10 years. Because Holland Dozier Holland were contractually locked to Motown's publishing arm, they couldn't even use their own names on new songs for a while. They wrote under the pseudonym Edith Wayne to work around the injunction. The label that replaced them, they formed their own, Invictus Records and Hot Wax Records, both in Detroit, scoring hits with Freda Payne's Band of Gold and the chairman of the board's Give Me Just a Little More Time. Before you break my heart. Gordy's greatest hit factory, operating across the street without him. The departure of Holland Dozier Holland was not just a business loss. It was the moment Motown's specific, irreplaceable sound began to dissolve, and Gordy knew it. Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. Number 8, Marvin Gaye goes on strike. Brother. This is the story of a genius who had to go on strike to get his own label to release the greatest album they would ever put out. It is 1970. Marvin Gaye is married to Berry Gordy's sister Anna. Brother, there's far too many. His singing partner, Tammy Terrell, collapsed on stage in his arms in 1967 from a brain tumor she would die from in 1970. His marriage is falling apart. His country is at war. His brother Frankie came home from Vietnam and couldn't stop talking about what he'd seen. Gaye entered Hitsville, USA on June 1, 1970 to record a song written by Four Tops member Obie Benson about police brutality. Benson had witnessed in Berkeley, California. Tell me what's going on. Woo! Gaye rewrote it, made it his own, added streets, ghetto, war, grief, recorded it in a way nobody at Motown had ever recorded anything. Talk to me, honey, through you. Then he walked it into Berry Gordy's office. Gordy called it, and this is a direct quote, "the worst thing I ever heard in my life." He told Gaye the jazz scatting in the middle was old. He said Motown didn't do protest records. He refused to release it. Marvin Gaye went on strike. He refused to record another note until Gordy released What's Going On. 8 months into the standoff, Motown's A&R head, Harry Balk, desperate for new Gaye product, went behind Gordy's back. He directed sales vice president Barney Ailes to press 100,000 copies of the single and ship them to radio stations across the country. Without Gordy's knowledge or approval,
Hey, what's going on? Wanna know what's going on?
The song sold over 200,000 copies in a single week, fastest selling Motown single in history up to that point. Gordy drove to Gaye's home and told him to make whatever album he wanted. Get it done in 30 days. What's Going On was released May 21, 1971. It is consistently ranked the greatest album ever made. Rolling Stone called it the #1 album of all time in 2020.
Let's go on.
3 singles, all #1 on the R&B chart. What's Going On, Mercy, Mercy Me, Inner City Blues. Marvin Gaye became the first male artist to place 3 top 10 singles on the Hot 100 from a single album. Gordy was so uncomfortable with its politics, he released it not on Motown proper, but on the subsidiary label Tamla. He didn't want his name on it. And then it became the greatest album in his company's history. That is the contradiction that helped push Berry Gordy toward Hollywood, a place where he could control the story. Number 7. The Funk Brothers Find a Note on the Door.
When it's cold outside.
They played on more #1 records than the Beatles, Elvis Presley, the Beach Boys, and the Rolling Stones combined, and most people had never heard their names. The Funk Brothers, Detroit's greatest secret. James Jamerson on bass, Benny Benjamin on drums, Earl Van Dyke on keys, Robert White on guitar, Jack Ashford on percussion. They called their basement recording space at Hitsville the Snake Pit. They would play jazz clubs all night at venues like the Flame and the 20 Grand, then walk into Studio A in the morning and create hits.
When it's cold outside.
James Jamerson played the bass line on My Girl, on I Heard It Through the Grapevine, on Reach Out, I'll Be There, on What's Going on nearly every Motown record made between 1962 and 1968. He was not credited on a single one. Berry Gordy kept them anonymous, paid them union scale, about $52.50 per session. No royalties, no credit, no acknowledgement. Marvin Gaye was the first artist to list their names on the liner notes of What's Going On in 1971. 1 year later, it was over. On a June morning in 1972, members of the Funk Brothers arrived at Hitsville, USA to play a scheduled session. They found a note on the studio door. Session canceled. Will reschedule. There was no reschedule. The Washington Post confirmed it decades later. When Motown suddenly packed up and relocated to Los Angeles in 1972, the musicians learned of the move only when they showed up at Studio A and found a notice on the door. Session canceled. Will reschedule. California already had plenty of session musicians. The Funk Brothers were not invited. James Jamerson followed the label to Los Angeles anyway. He could not navigate the new scene. The style was different. The networks were different. He was no longer the heartbeat of anything. He descended into alcoholism and depression. He was hospitalized several times. James Jamerson died on August 2, 1983. He was 47 years old, largely forgotten. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted him in 2000, 17 years after his death. The Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award came in 2004. Benny Benjamin, the drummer, had already died of a stroke in 1969, age 43.
You would say, what would happen make me?
Richard Pistol Allen and Johnny Griffith both passed away within months of the 2002 documentary Standing in the Shadows of Motown, which finally told the world who had made the music it loved. They never fully experienced the recognition they had earned. Detroit built the sound. Los Angeles didn't need it. Number 6, the Four Tops Get Fired. The Four Tops, 1965. The Four Tops had been with Motown since 1963. 9 years, 30 singles. Levi Stubbs, Abdul Duke Fakir, Ronaldo Obi Benson, Lawrence Payton. I Can't Help Myself. Reach Out, I'll Be There, Bernadette. Standing in the Shadows of Love. Baby, I Need Your Loving. One of the most consistent hit-making groups in Motown history. And unlike most of the label's acts, they were Detroit to the bone. When Berry Gordy announced the move to Los Angeles, the Four Tops made their position clear. They didn't want to go. They were Detroit men. Their families were there. Their community was there. The city was in their sound. Ewart Abner, the new president of Motown's recording division, heard their decision and fired them. That was it. 9 years, 3 decades of hits in the making. And because they wouldn't leave Detroit, they were cut loose. They bounced back. In 1973, the year after being dropped, they signed with ABC Dunhill Records and released Ain't No Woman Like the One I've Got. It hit number 4 on the pop chart, number 1 R&B, but they never sounded quite the same, and Motown was never quite the same without them. Levi Stubbs once said, Motown was a family until it wasn't. The Four Tops refused to leave Detroit. Motown left them. Number 5, Gladys Knight Walks Out. There is no more fitting farewell in the history of American music than the one Gladys Knight delivered to Berry Gordy. Willingly or not, Gladys Knight and the Pips had been at Motown since 1966, and despite having the voice, arguably the greatest female soul voice the label ever housed, they were consistently treated as second tier. Diana Ross got the film deals. Diana Ross got the promotion. Diana Ross got the cover of Life magazine. Gladys Knight got told to wait. William Guest of the Pips said it plainly. It was a pleasure to get up and go to work. Many people would come down even if they weren't scheduled that day and just hang out. It was like one big family. That family, however, had favorites.
Wondering that same thing too.
In 1973, Butter Records came with a deal worth close to $1 million. Gladys Knight said later that had Motown matched it, they would have stayed. Motown didn't match it. Before she left, the group recorded one final single for the label. Neither one of us wants to be the first to say goodbye. A slow, aching ballad about two people who know a relationship is over but can't bring themselves to end it. It won the Grammy Award for Best Pop Vocal Performance by a duo or group in 1973. It hit number 2 pop and number 4 R&B. Gladys Knight said, years later that neither one of us was exactly what she wanted to say to Motown after 7 years on the label. It was their goodbye, and they let the song say it for them. At Buddha Records, with creative freedom and a real budget, Gladys Knight and the Pips recorded Midnight Train to Georgia, #1 pop, #1 R&B.
When it comes to saying goodbye.
Grammy Award for Best Rhythm and Blues Vocal Performance by a Duo or Group. The song Motown never got to put out.
So we just go on.
#4, Berry Gordy's Hollywood Obsession. Here is the truth nobody in the Motown story wants to say out loud. Berry Gordy did not move to Los Angeles for the music. He moved for the movies. He moved because he was in love with Diana Ross. And because he believed Diana Ross deserved to be a movie star. Gordy had shaped Diana Ross's career from the inside of the Supremes, pushing her to the front, giving her the best songs, making her the face of everything Motown touched.
Never worry. Nowhere.
When Diana went solo in 1970 and released Ain't No Mountain High Enough, it hit #1 pop, #1 R&B. But Gordy wanted more. He wanted to produce a biopic about Billie Holiday starring Diana Ross.
Can't stop me, babe.
In the early 1970s, that was radical. A black-owned company producing a major Hollywood film starring a black woman in the role of one of the most complex and tragic figures in music history. Gordy bought out Paramount's interest in the project himself when the deal got complicated. Diana Ross studied Billie Holiday obsessively. Motown executive Suzanne DePass later said, "I've never seen anybody woodshed like that."
Or the lips that used to touch yours so tenderly.
There was even one point when she sounded more like Billie Holiday than Billie Holiday, and Berry Gordy told her to back off and put a little more Diana Ross back in there. Lady Sings the Blues opened in October 1972. It earned 5 Academy Award nominations, including Best Actress for Diana Ross. Roger Ebert called it deeply moving. Time magazine later placed it on its list of the top 25 most important movies on race. Diana Ross lost the Oscar to Liza Minnelli for Cabaret. Some who were there said the full-page ads Motown bought in trade papers during the Academy campaign, bragging about Ross's performance daily, turned Academy voters against her. The love that drove Berry Gordy to Hollywood was the same love that cost them the Oscar. After Lady Sings the Blues, Gordy produced 2 more Diana Ross films. Mahogany in 1975, widely panned. The Wiz in 1978, a commercial failure. The Hollywood dream cost Motown its soul. #3, The Supremes Collapse. On January 14, 1970, Diana Ross performed her final concert with the Supremes at the Frontier Hotel in Las Vegas. The group's final single together, Someday We'll Be Together, had already reached #1 in December 1969. But here's what most people don't know. Diana Ross didn't sing lead on that record. The lead vocal was performed by a woman named Johnny Bristol's girlfriend. The Supremes, the actual group, barely appeared on the track at all. It was a Motown assembly line decision, a song pieced together to send Ross out on a high. The Supremes had been Motown's most famous act.
Yes, we
12 number ones, the first black group to perform at certain major venues, ambassadors to the White House, Ed Sullivan regulars. And Berry Gordy had spent years dismantling them to build Diana Ross as a solo star. Florence Ballard, the founding member, had been pushed out of the group in 1967. Replaced without warning, she sued Motown. The lawsuit failed. Florence Ballard died in 1976 on welfare, unable to pay her bills. She was 32 years old. Mary Wilson stayed, fought for the Supreme's name, kept the group alive. But without Diana, without Florence, and without Dozier writing for them, the hits stopped coming. The Supremes' collapse was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice made by one man who had decided that one woman was more important than group. Berry Gordy broke the Supremes to build a movie star. And when he chased that movie star to Hollywood, he took Motown's most recognizable face with him and left the city that made her.
I made a big mistake.
Number 2, the Funk Brothers, Get Left Behind. We told you what happened when they found the note on the door. Now we need to talk. 1, Berry Gordy sells Motown.
I'm still strong. Ooh, baby. Yeah.
On June 28, 1988, the wire services broke a story that hit Detroit like a second earthquake. Berry Gordy had sold Motown Records for $61 million to MCA Inc. and Boston Ventures, the company that started with an $800 loan from his family savings pool, the company that employed 300 people in Detroit, the company that produced the sound that defined a generation, sold.
That time I went and said goodbye.
But here is the detail that changes the meaning of the entire story. Gordy needed Stevie Wonder's consent to sell. It was written into an earlier contract negotiated by Stevie's attorney, Johannan Vigoda. Stevie Wonder had contractual approval over any sale of Motown records. In 1986, the first time Gordy tried to sell, he backed out at the last minute. MCA had offered me more money than I could spend in a lifetime. Gordy wrote in his autobiography, To Be Loved, but I just didn't want to give it up at that time.
When I touched them, there is nothing, girl.
By 1988, he was ready, and Stevie Wonder gave his consent. Gordy explained the sale with 5 words. It was no fun anymore. He also said, I wanted to take the legacy and put it in stronger hands.
Whoa, you got my future in your hand, baby.
Smokey Robinson told him, it doesn't matter who owns Motown, what's important is the legacy.
Here I am, signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours.
MCA sold it to Polygram. Polygram was absorbed into Universal Music Group, the most successful black-owned business in American history. The company that gave the world Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, the Supremes, the Temptations, the Jackson 5, Smokey Robinson, the Four Tops, Gladys Knight, is now a division of a multinational conglomerate headquartered in New York City.
I know you're my only desire.
Gordy kept the publishing. Between 1997 and 2004, he sold the Jobeat catalog, 15,000 songs, 240 of which he wrote himself, to EMI Music Publishing for a total of $322 million.
I'm yours.
The $800 loan became $383 million. But Hitsville, USA, the building on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit where it all began, is now a museum, not a studio, not a label, a museum. And the city of Detroit never got its music back.